There's a couple things happening at the moment in the clickbaity cinematography film news cycle. There's a whole hubbub about this new sci-fi movie where they've shot like a large chunk of it on a prosumer camera, and whenever that happens, you hear it everywhere for like a solid year. Our Flag Means Death TV show on like Binge or something was shot on the Blackmagic 6K Pro, and the creator was shot like a large chunk of it. Apparently, it could be hyperbole. Was shot on like a Sony FX3, swapped in and out with an RE65, I think. And it's got me thinking about a question that I simply have not thought to ask at any point during all of our discussions about cameras and dynamic range and color gamut and sensor size and all of these things, given that at least, and feel free to just say that what I'm saying is wrong. That's the point of this. We've seen a lot of prosumer cameras. That's it. So the weather's been nice, hasn't it? It's been a good couple days. Yeah, it's been a good couple days.
You go on.
Why do we use cinema cameras?
I think a lot of it comes down to destination, potential viewing size, and budget.
Mm-hmm. On the budget thing, I realize that when people hear something like Greg Fraser and Oren Suffer using an FX3, a $6,000 camera on a big sci-fi film, whenever something happens like that, people always go, this camera's only $6,000. And I'm 100% certain that they're using a $6,000 camera with like $50,000 worth of equipment on top of it.
Yeah.
Like a lens that costs, triple the amount the camera did and whatever. That normally goes, I think in the news cycle, normally goes unrecognized, admittedly, because it sounds cool to say it was shot in a prosumer camera. The FX3 in this situation was used apparently because it's really good in low light, according to these guys. Hence, they wanted to shoot a lot of scenes with available or ambient light, and they used it for that purpose, which makes me think that most of the dark scenes you see in the trailer are shot on that camera. Ridiculous to think about because it looks great. So I know it's still a case of using the right tool for the job, but if you can buy a camera for $6,000 that with enough equipment does the trick, then why do you spend $50,000 on a camera body? Like what's the difference? Do they have, is it just like better dynamic range, better color gamut, faster? Given that prosumer cameras are getting all hyped up nowadays, what's the big deal with cinema cameras? I don't know why I haven't asked this before. I just assumed they were good.
I don't think there is a single thing. There's always some kind of combination. I think sometimes it's might be easier to flip the question.
Mm-hmm.
What do you sacrifice by shooting on prosumer cameras?
What I think you sacrifice, I think one of the things I noticed when I picked up a Blackmagic 6K was that it's extremely user-friendly. Whereas like the red cameras that we use at JMC weren't user-friendly. You'd have to like know how it worked. So it opens up a lot more in-camera control of the image than what the 6K Pro and other user-friendly prosumer cameras would offer. At least that's what I think. You could be sacrificing that by using a prosumer camera. Things like thermal management, perhaps, aren't as good on a smaller, more deliberately compact prosumer camera. Maybe they're not as modular. Maybe it's harder to attach equipment to them. I'm just spitballing.
Yeah, a lot of that are valid kind of sacrifices or deliberations you're going to have to make when choosing. A lot of the times, yes, it is a matter of how much do you need to modify and rig up and find workarounds to make this piece of equipment workable.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion, I personally, like if I had a choice, I'd prefer not to shoot a whole feature, a whole TV shows on that kind of equipment because it's just too much hassle to get it set up in a way that rigging it on something like a proper dolly. So by that, I mean something that actually goes on track with operator riding on the dolly. If you want that really kind of solid camera movement feel, as opposed to something where you can almost feel that this is a lightweight camera body being moved in three-dimensional space, then these bodies aren't really set up for that. The viewing systems, the way to see the picture once it's rigged on something with a bit more heft, gravitas, they're really designed for kind of like being in line with the operator, whereas so much of the bigger camera movement mounting and hardware is set up for kind of slightly offset. This is based on cameras that if you go handheld, you go shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
So ergonomically, kind of like always needing that distance because you have to be right in line with the camera, means that you increase your footprint that way. If you can be slightly to the side, you're compacting your footprint.
Oh, okay.
Right? Does that make sense?
Yep. Yep.
So it's kind of set up to be operated and finding shots like from within there. Does that make sense?
A little bit. It sounds to me
like,
just, yeah.
So it's kind of like set up so that you are still kind of like the old school photographer.
Where the viewing is just...
Not just that, but ergonomically, it kind of subconsciously pushes you into finding shots where like it's a camera that is physically within that kind of distance of the physical operator, right?
Yeah. Whereas a cinema camera, you're offered not only more of variety in monitoring, but also more variety in where pieces of equipment go, and therefore the size of the footprint, the shape of the camera's footprint, the actual angle at which you approach the image is different. So
yes. So overall, it's a much bigger physical footprint, but it's made to be more flexible.
Right.
That's not to say that you can't mount that same camera in all of those kind of situations and scenarios, but getting image out of it without a significant delay, powering them over a longer time period, as in HDMI always has a delay in it. So it doesn't matter if you have like a no latency transmitter, you're already starting straight out of the camera with some delay in it. So it's all kind of based on one person, a photographer.
Yeah, like it's a prosumer camera sounds like... Do you remember Windows 8?
Not really.
Back in the day, Microsoft had this like big explosion of... It was like a 5-year long period where all they wanted to do was square tiles. That's all they wanted to do with any of their OS. They did it on their phones.
Right. Yeah.
It was terrible. And you opened up Windows 8 and it was just square tiles, and that was it. And they were calling it a big revolution, and everyone hated it because it was supposed to and might have sped up the entire process of navigating your computer. It just, you had a bunch of tiles. That was every single thing you possibly need to access. But the second you needed to do anything moderately complex with it, customize the way it works, like move things around, it fell apart. Not very useful. It was super sluggish, not very intuitive. They scrapped the whole design. The only way you can see it now is if you press the home button on Windows 10, and that's it. Is it kind of a case of in order to make things more immediately accessible for the user, the prosumer camera has kind of lost a bit of the modularness, the incredible precise changes that you can make with a cinema camera, whether it be the shape or the image that it captures, or the way you view things?
I don't think it's ever had even awareness of asking that question, to be honest. It's aimed at a market where there isn't even an awareness of how do you map this to hostess tray, or how do you map this to a ZG rig, or how do you map this to a whatever rig.
As a person with a complete lack of awareness of those things, I am probably a part of that market.
How do you get time code in and out that isn't going to drift over a whole 24-hour period? All of those kind of questions. Like these cameras live or are aimed at a market where there isn't even an awareness of asking those questions. It's a little bit like, why do professional kitchens not just shift everything they do into multifunction food processors?
I see what you mean now. That's a very good analogy.
At the end of the day, can you make the same food? Yes.
Ostensibly, yeah.
But when you have a whole kitchen brigade, then to do one specific task, you have to modify that modular equipment so much that you might just buy a piece of equipment that does that one thing all day, 16 hours a day. To sum up the ergonomics and modularity, I think at a certain point, having everything be the lightest and smallest it can be is not conducive to general image making. At a certain point, you need some mass for a more stable image. And I'm not sure it's really straightforward to explain why that is a thing until people have the opportunity to try something with more mass and see the kind of added stability that comes with added mass.
Okay. I've got an idea in my mind, but I'm not going to express it.
I think like if the camera can go in every kind of possible kind of whimsical fashion, any time you want, any direction you want, flip and flop and up and down and side and whatever you want, I believe at a certain point you do get the sense that it's being recorded with something that isn't bigger than this.
like a virtual camera. It's kind of the effect you get from. It's like how when you have one of those big VFX movies with like giant monsters and stuff, and people always say that the best way to shoot it is like from the ground or from a place where the camera could be. Otherwise, at a certain point, your audience kind of gets a sense that there's just nothing really happening in front of you. The camera feels more like a bird than it does a camera.
I think that's a good example. I think at a certain point, if you never go bigger than something like a prosumer, which is styled on a photographer's SLR camera, think of that as a kind of a movement that is based on either a mosquito, a fly, or a hummingbird, as opposed
Whereas
to
like a cinema camera is more of a human movement.
No, I'm going to keep this avian. What kind of movement are you going to get from a condor?
The bird? Like weighty, you know, sort of.
So that mass.
Slow, tangible movement.
But solid, like smooth, or an albatross compared to a mosquito. That's not to say that there isn't a place for that mosquito movement, but if you only ever stick to that style of camera, then it's going to be very difficult to do something else. Vice versa, you know, like you're not going to get that mosquito movement out of like a big honk of, I don't know, like an IMAX camera. Have you ever seen the size of the 3-strip Technicolor cameras?
I have not. I'll Google it. Hang on. Oh, right. These ones. Yeah. Oh, wait. Never mind. Oh, my God. You mean the one that's nearly the size of someone's torso?
That's a pretty small one then. Should be about the size of a fridge.
Oh, my God.
So when you think like your classic golden age Hollywood movie, there's a certain type of movement, right?
Yeah.
There isn't that kind of jittery, kind of like, you know, whip pan, whatever. It's solid.
It's all very deliberate and...
Yes. Yeah.
It moves fairly slowly. It moves in like a direction, or it like strafes every now and then. I know what you mean. And yeah, it feels weighty. Like it feels like there's a very, very big thing.
Yeah.
I have a really dumb follow-up on this. Hypothetically, why don't you just strap a bunch of bricks to your prosumer camera?
You could.
Why not just make it heavier?
You could, but then no one who buys and goes in for a prosumer style camera, part of the reason why they're going for that is that part of their criteria is they want it lightweight.
Yeah. Fair enough. But now that you have it, I mean, you can just make it weighty. You can strap a whole lot of heavy equipment to it. See what happens.
Sure, you can. But let me put it this way. You got a phone, a smartphone.
I have got a phone.
Yeah.
There's the phone.
So part of the annoyance with that over a desktop computer is you got no keyboard. You got limited battery life. You got limited kind of screen. So, you know, you can bolt all that onto your phone. Why don't you?
Because that would just be silly.
And that's kind of like the whole adding weight, making a mirrorless camera more bulky. That's kind of no purpose to it. Like it's a whole different paradigm, right?
So it sounds like the best way to describe this issue, especially like in this area, is that if you want to use a phone, you use a phone. And if you want to use a laptop, you use a laptop. And phones and laptops perform very, very similar tasks, if not the exact same tasks. But they do it in a way that they're both designed to do them differently for different tasks. Like they're both designed to optimize a certain use and a certain workflow, hence why you don't just use one. Is that kind of that's the case?
The person who's drawn to a prosumer camera or a mirrorless camera just don't have any concept at all that too little weight can be a drawback. That too small
I didn't know that until you mentioned
can be a drawback.
Yeah.
Particularly when the marketing around it is do anything you want, create anything you like. This is all you need. I'm not necessarily saying that that isn't valid, but I do think I am biased because I've come up through a background where there is an assumption that you're going to go out with a crew. So the mass and the weight within certain parameters, it's never really been a consideration for me. And, you know, I've shot...
Because you're not the one handling it? Or
well, you've got a crew to help you out with it.
Yeah.
I've shot features with prosumer cameras. So shot a feature with a consumer camera, like that kind of HDV tape camera.
The whole thing?
Where the only way to actually get manual exposure control would be to kind of wave it around until I get the exposure settings I want. As in, it'll auto-expose. Yeah, auto-expose. Okay. Now I've got that shutter speed. Now I've got that aperture. Lock the exposure, and I'm going to shoot. It is possible to do, but it is a right real pain in the backside.
Sounds like a pain in the backside.
And a lot of it would be the same with a lot of these prosumer cameras, right? Some of them are more pros, some of them are more sumer. There is a bit of a spectrum, but a lot of it comes down to, you heard the saying, you can make a horse walk on two legs, but is it really the best use of a horse?
I see.
Now, this isn't some kind of new phenomenon. Super 16 was invented, or 16mm was invented as a way of making things more accessible and to be able to reduce the footprint of shooting.
I think there are a lot of very notable older indie films that were shot on Super 16, right? I think Evil Dead was, right? Or am I saying complete garbage right now?
We've had this discussion. The Wrestler, Moonrise Kingdom.
Right. Sorry, I'm following.
Fight.
Yeah, not just indie films. I agree. I mean,
all 16mm or Super 16 variations there.
Wow. Sorry, yeah, I had those because we were talking about that in terms of sensor size. Now I absorbed that information as like those were shot on Super 35 size digital sensors, which I think is equivalent to Super 16 nowadays, sort of a little bit kind of.
The whole kind of like shooting on prosumer formats is not new either. There was the whole Dogma 95. I kind of took that to an almost political manifesto level.
Ah, yes, that rings a bell.
Are you familiar with any of the Dogma 95 movies?
I am, because I've heard that name before. Let me have a squiz. That's it. Yep, Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg. I don't think I've seen the Dogma 95 movies at any point. I've been meaning to watch The Idiots for a while because it sounds like a lot of fun, but that's pretty much it. Yeah. I know that that's where I remember it from, Lars von Trier and Thomas Vinterberg.
Monsters was shot on a prosumer camera with a 35mm optical adapter.
Well, I guess it's kind of just Gareth Edwards sticking to his roots then, potentially, with this whole, Sony FX3 situation.
Yeah, that could very well be, because the consumer camera he used from memory would be that Sony EX.
Well,
EX1 or EX3. Can't remember which one.
Didn't he do all the VFX in that movie himself? I think he did.
Yeah.
Jesus.
It's not something new. And I think in some aspects, the entry-level prosumer, even consumer cameras, can look a lot better than any alternatives that independent, no-budget filmmakers had 30 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at the rapid uptake of the Canon 5D Mark II. The 5D Mark II was the one that really, it would have been 2008, 2009, I believe. It was intended as a pro photojournalist camera and had an added video functionality. So, it got a relatively shallow depth of field in a reasonably affordable package. Being able to use the existing Canon compatible stills lenses out there made a whole lot of quality optics available as well. Wasn't long before filmmakers started kind of going, hang on, we are onto something here. There was an episode of House.
The show about the Doctor, Hugh Laurie.
Yeah. Show. So there was a season finale that year. It was shot exclusively on 5D Mark IIs.
Wow.
Not long after, I think it was 2010 maybe, there was a feature film called Act of Valor that was shot by...
I'm Googling.
95% on 5D Mark IIs. There were Sundance films, etc., shot on this camera. And this is a camera that is probably kind of sitting in that kind of FX3, maybe even a little bit cheaper.
Wow.
So when you compare that to something like a 35mm camera at the time, I think sometimes you do go, there's a great freedom in being able to just pick up this camera and move it however I want. And I do think for some directors, for some cinematographers, I think at a certain point, depending on your personality, I do think that the more modular, the more mass... I guess the technical word is more massive, but that just makes it sound so huge. So the more massive.
The more massy, mass-esque.
Yeah, more deliberate kind of deliberation that comes with that for some personalities can be really stifling. I can see that. I think there are certain filmmakers who don't have that patience. They won't be able to pick up and move and act on an idea as soon as it pops into their mind.
That's it. Sorry, I know we keep circling back to Gareth Edwards. That is apparently a part of his shooting style. Like, he likes to pick up the camera on the spur of the moment if he has an idea and just operate it.
There are two sides to that makes that kind of appealing to move away from. I think on the one hand, we did speak a little bit about this in terms of how I see narrative filmmaking's closest artistic cousin being architecture.
Yeah.
Where you kind of like, you don't just kind of whimsically change an idea because it's got ramifications in 3 dimensions. And I do think that for a certain style of filmmaker, that's not how they approach filmmaking. I know plenty of filmmakers like that who don't like any kind of slowdown or friction or like, hang on, but if we are going to do that, we're also going to have to do X, etc. Like, some filmmakers want the production process to be much, much more immediate. And yeah, I can kind of see where having a 15 kilo camera lens combination is detrimental to, or can be frustrating or get in the way. I think the other side to that as well is the American production model with the unions. So on a union shoot, are you familiar with that whole union crew system in the US?
I think there's all I know is that there's a certain amount this person has to be paid. There's a certain amount of hours they need to have, a certain amount of time they need for lunch. Are you leading up to saying that maybe if you're on a union shoot, you don't have that flexibility that could possibly change the entire schedule?
Kind of interesting, actually, because the American union system is less about those kind of protections than it is about job protection.
Right.
So every major career role has a union, and if it is a union production, then only a member of said union can perform XYZ task.
Okay. So the director can't be like, give me the camera if the DP is a part of the union. Yeah, gotcha.
No. Like, even the DP.
The camera operator is a part of the union.
Aha.
All right. I'm following.
Yeah. So in an American crew environment, at least like 10, 15 years ago, someone like Gareth Edwards doing that would have been smacked down.
Wow.
If you're in that environment again, then that's another kind of step that moves you, the creator, away from the image. Because in the American Union kind of production system, the appropriate way of doing that is to instruct and direct the camera operator on what kind of shot you have in mind. So much of it is about counterculture and the antithesis. So for a long, long while now, the kind of smaller crew, smaller footprint, more immediacy has kind of been what the antithesis, the counterculture, has been craving.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, that's been echoed through different time periods, different zeitgeists of filmmaking. Pretty much all versions of New Wave, French and American New Wave in particular,
they're very fond of just a person with a camera.
Yes, because it was a reaction to golden era Hollywood, i.e., that fridge on wheels.
Yeah, being operated by 6 guys and the director's in a chair somewhere. Yeah.
So I think that to an extent has always been there. And I think we have had a trend moving towards more and more wild ways of being able to move the camera due to better quality in smaller packages.
Yeah, I think a really specific example just came to mind and I actually couldn't remember what it was. I just Googled a movie that I watched recently called Athena, which is a French film. It's one of those movies that is designed to look like it was done in one take. And I was thinking to myself, that must have been shot in a very light camera because I remember it looking like that. And then as I Googled it, I gradually reassessed what I was thinking about as I remembered the images of the film. And yeah, it was shot in IMAX digital with an Arri Alexa 65 camera, which the director describes, and I quote, as a fridge. And the article says the size of the camera required a certain old school steadiness to its movements. So it sounds to me that you've just pretty much stated the most correct thing about the current zeitgeist. Steadiness being called old school, especially, is kind of an interesting thing to hear.
There's a certain group of cinematographers that for a while we've been stating that it's not going to be long before the most radical aesthetic is going to be everything on tracks, on dolly, steady, smooth.
Yes. I'm so excited.
Deliberately, properly framed. Like, we've been saying this for like 10, 15 years. So it may not happen, but it kind of feels like at a certain point, like adhering to proper craft kind of feels either extremely old-fashioned now, or it's so old-fashioned that it is going to become radical, if that makes sense.
I know that we've definitely spoken about this before, and like I have a bit of a desire to try and emulate the kind of craft element of it. Everything like very rigidly framed and like everything in the image well thought out. I watched a movie that wasn't very good the other night from like the mid 90s, but I was in love with the way it was shot. It was excellent. It was just everything in the frame is super well thought out. The camera moves a fair bit, but not in a way that seems obnoxious. It's all very deliberate. Everything feels extremely deliberate and well constructed. And I guess it sounds to me that you're in kind of the Peter Weir camp of movie making. The whole like when he received his honorary, I think it was an honorary Oscar, he said something about, don't you just love something that's well crafted, even if it's not like a stunning piece of art, a very, very well crafted movie in the way that it looks, in the way that it sounds, in the way that it's shot, in the way every single frame is constructed. Something really, really well crafted is really valuable to him. And I think the prosumer, smaller body, low budget kind of situation and the popularity of that, picking it up and shooting something, being more accessible, especially right now, is probably, for better or for worse, kind of de-emphasizing the craft into creating a singular image because the stakes aren't as high anymore, if that makes sense. Like, you don't necessarily have to do as much forethought prior to creating an image, because if you were shooting on film, you had to think about it completely. Otherwise, if you fucked it up, it's fucked up. There's a roll of film that's ruined. But now, because you have your digital cameras that are steadily getting smaller and more consumer friendly, the amount of images that we see that haven't been as well thought through and more deliberately thought through, there's more of those images, if that makes sense. So I think if there's an example of a radical, it's not radical by any means at all, but it's like the closest thing I can think of to what you're talking about. I think that the most recent Top Gun film, I think because it is a legacy sequel, so it's trying to emulate a certain style anyway, has a very deliberate, well-crafted feel to it, if that makes sense. Like it's a blockbuster that's shot in a way I haven't seen in a while. I think that the director, I'm not sure who the DP is, but the director, Joseph Kosinski, seems to have that style. He really likes, his style isn't showy, it's just well crafted. Maybe you would be more open to the films of like Joseph Kosinski potentially if you pick them up at any point. They're not necessarily socially or artistically groundbreaking, but like they have that, they might be an indicator that blockbuster films are kind of reverting back to the deliberate shot placement situation that you're discussing.
I think part of it is a loss of craft in general when it comes to image making. I think one of the examples for me is matching eye lines and shot reverse shots and generally constructing a sequence, a scene that really maintains and respects the continuity of space and time, where it's easy for the viewer to orient themselves and by knowing a set of rules being able to construct that continuity. To me, it's kind of like time and time again, the ability to be able to do so seems to come as a revelation to beginning filmmakers.
What do you mean?
As in, like, there are rules that can allow you, the beginner, to be able to shape time and space in such a way that it feels like it naturally flows together and exists in the same time and space.
Instead of just documenting what's in front of you.
Or, just kind of like going, what's the wildest thing I can do next?
Yeah.
And the subtle differences that you get from that, from something that's actually constructed to show a sequence of time and space. I mean, like, that seems to come as a eye-opener to a lot of beginners. Am I right or wrong?
Yeah,
or
I guess
right
it kind
or
of,
partially wrong in that?
I definitely approached like when I started at JMC. I think that everyone has this misconception, at least now, that it's about making nice looking images. The idea of making it a cohesive, like the part of the job being like making a cohesive space and a cohesive sense of time wasn't something that I had in my mind at all.
To me, that's kind of like just a symptom of a loss of the awareness of the craft that goes into telling stories through sequential moving images. Yeah, I kind of see it like part of the symptom as well being the way that teaching fundamental coverage, continuity style coverage gets skipped over. Kind of like, this is the boring bit. Like, we're just going to tell you, so we've told you, and then, we're going to skip on to the part where you can do whatever you want.
I'm still working on basic continuity and coverage. I'm very grateful for the fact that I have a sense that I need to hone that.
I really, really do encourage that one as almost kind of like a Chinese whispers kind of game. I shoot one shot, now you go and shoot the next shot. And match it. Then whatever shot you give back, I'm going to have to figure out how to move the story on, connecting on from your previous shot.
I could send someone a single shot. They could send me the reverse. I could send them the master, that kind of thing. Wow. I might just have to do that. In black and white, perhaps? Who knows?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
That's certainly going to make the matching easier.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
One of the reasons why I try to get students to step away from the over-the-shoulder just for a while. I'm not saying like I'm going to ban it completely.
I've done it over the shoulder in 60 years.
But I think you pick up the craft of crafting time and space better if you have to do it.
Devoid of any visual indicator of someone else in the space?
Yeah, and also without like being able to rely on the physical space in front of you, the real space. So that trying to create that sense of time and space in two actual physically different times and spaces really show you how much of an understanding you have of the crafting of time and space.
Yeah, that reminds me of like when I shot the first short, I had no idea about no idea what eye lines were, no idea necessarily had to match the angle at which the camera was shooting the subject. I don't know that they had to match, the precise area, like the equivalent side of each character. Headroom wasn't a consideration. All those things that kind of create an easy to absorb collection of images during like a shot reverse shot. I just didn't know. And it just looks bad. Yeah, it's just, and I think one of the things about prosumer cameras is that it gives people a lot of leniency to create an image that looks good, but might not be constructed well, if that makes sense.
Yes. No, I think that's an excellent way of describing it. Yeah.
Why, thank you.
Yeah. I think that the increased quality of prosumer entry-level cameras has kind of allowed for a lot more of a spray and pray approach as opposed to developing the ability to construct the image.
You'll be delighted to hear that I've seen people say this kind of thing verbatim on the internet now, especially in the past year. I saw a thread on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter. I saw this on Instagram, via Instagram, on Twitter. It was just someone who just watches movies recreationally, like a normal person, saying saying off the cuff, just like, isn't it strange that a movie from the 90s or the early 2000s can be like a piece of shit, like a bad movie, and then at once just like drop a shot that looks better than anything you've ever seen in 10 years, or has like a better effect on you than anything you've seen in the past decade. And then if you check the comments on the Twitter thread and the Instagram post, and all the people there everyone from different walks of life are saying the exact same thing we're saying now. Luckily, what we're saying is not a new line of thinking. I'm sure you'll be relieved to hear that. It seems that it's I mean, then again, I know that social media is curated to you, so it could not be entering the zeitgeist. It's just entering the Ethan circle. That people are starting to notice the kind of haphazard appearance of a lot of images. I think people are becoming more aware of, or at least maybe not that, but becoming more aware of how constructed images were in the 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s. One person made reference to isn't it so interesting how city streets just used to look better in movies? Someone said the cameras weren't as good, so they had to think more about what was in front of the camera. Someone followed that up with, they used to spray down the streets with water to make them more reflective, to make the image look better. Like all of these small details, you don't really hear them considered as often. And to hear someone just be like, the cameras weren't as good, so they were thinking more about what was in front of the camera, was like a really interesting thing to hear, especially just like out of nowhere on social media.
Yeah, there's still that kind of thinking that the camera is this magic wand that just makes everything appear great, or that the camera itself makes things appear better.
I'll admit to experiencing that effect every now and then. Like the second I looked through the viewfinder of the Red camera that we use at JMC, I was like, wow, this looks great. It faded away very quickly, but the very first time I saw it, I was like, wow, this looks excellent. It might have been a placebo effect, but
yeah, I'd be quite kind of interested in trying that out, and try introducing beginners to all these different cameras through some kind of external feed where they don't see the camera, but there's no overlays saying what camera image is coming from.
You could do that one day. You could bring out 3 TVs and plug the JVC and the FS700 and the Red into each of them. mix them around like a ball under a cup and see what happens.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to get around that. I'm still I think I've told this story before, but it's still something where I'm not 100% sure how to approach it. Like I had a student who was she felt that we hadn't done enough camera, there was too much lighting, and she's going, when are we going to learn about the magic of the camera? And I'm like quite literally going, I was stumped, because when you really think about it, I don't actually know what that magic is that the camera does. You know what I'm saying?
Mean? Not really.
Exactly. So you know that whole thing about the camera adds £10, for example?
Right, yeah.
Like 50% of that is lighting, 50% of that is lenses and compression. So that's not the camera.
Okay.
And on and on and on and on.
Oh, okay, I'm following what you mean. In the end,
like
what does the camera even do?
Yeah, the whole kind of forced perspective and the way they made the Hobbit's relative size to Gandalf and all of that. That's
split diopter lens.
Well, that's part of it, but it's also forced perspective, i.e. optics.
Yeah.
So it's not that camera.
This is a great circle back to the very start. Why do we use cinema cameras? And the answer is, I don't know what cameras do.
A lot of the kind of like trickery and magic that most lay people associate with the camera is other things. It's staging, it's composition, it's probably 1/3 of what gets attributed to the camera is actually mise en scène. If you want a space to feel a certain size, it kind of helps building the set to that size.
There's that one movie where they did that. I can't remember what it is. It's in the desert or something.
I really had to tell this, but I don't actually understand what you mean by the magic of the camera. And I think she was offended. I think she thought I was taking the piss, but I genuinely, I don't know what the magic of the camera is.
I think one of the better things about the whole camera and lighting experience was the like lack of camera-ness, which felt very strange at first until like I think I've produced some pretty decent images with this camera by my standards, which are low, and none of that was to do with the camera.
See, my point.
Like it was to do with where I put the camera, and then where I put the light, and then where I put myself, which is a huge simplification of what you just said, but like it's the same deal.
The choice of the supported crude cinema camera model, and to be honest, even the term cinema camera to me is a bit of a not entirely sure what that entails, to be honest.
In an ideal world, how would you define a cinema camera? Generates an image designed to be viewed in a large space?
Yeah, something that's got a very robust lens mount, something that's got a very robust in and out system with no dropouts, with no delays, something that's got a flexible recording format, preferably RAW, something that's built to be modular and riggable, something that's built to have a certain thermal mass so that thermal management is less of an issue, something that is built to be able to interface with legacy rigging and camera movement scenarios. For me personally, in an ideal world, I'd really love for it to not have a menu.
Not have a menu?
Yeah.
Very interesting.
So that all the controls you got would be kind of physical dials, and that'd be it. You choose your ISO, shutter speed, frame rate. In an ideal world, that would be it.
It's like you want to use a film camera.
Sorry, what was that? That, to me, would take away some of the barriers, some of the frictions. I guess if I really want to sum it up, a camera that gives you so few options that you really need to know what you're doing, because that's kind of flippant way of saying it, that it has a performance envelope that is so high
that only a really, really talented person can use it.
Not necessarily that, but as in like you actually have to know what you're doing. Like
the gatekeeping camera.
No, I think the gates would be completely open, but it's just if you want to move through the gate, you have to work for it.
Right. There's a bunch of big burly men outside the gate, a bunch of bouncers.
No. It's just, completely open gate, but at the top of a really tall mountain. As in,
I
anyone
see.
can get there, but, it's going to take some effort.
Okay, I like that
Nothing
analog.
stopping you but
Analog
yourself.
analogy.
It would be, in an ideal world for me, it would be a camera where the reliance to create the image is on the wielder, the user, not the camera.
Right.
Although I think we are moving in that direction. I think more and more AI is trying to put itself in the place of trying to interpret what do you, the user, want to achieve. But I think having a camera where no decisions get made for you, obviously is going to have a much, much steeper learning curve because every choice you have will be on you. Well, obviously, that's where a lot of the craft lies. The craft is that understanding, how do I make X, Y, Z happen? In some ways, like you have alluded to, I think it is possible to approach a prosumer production like Cine camera style production.
Yeah, deck the thing out.
Yeah, that's one side to it, but the other side to it is just be a bit more deliberate, try and work things out more beforehand, rely less on trial and error on the day. So in the transition period from film to digital, on the low budget and the no budget end, there's a certain time period when if you kind of dressed up a digital camera, as in you put a follow focus on it, you put a matte box on it, you had a beefier, chunkier, proper tripod. For a little while, it was possible to trick experienced actors into thinking, is that a 16mm camera? Oh, okay. I better bring my A game.
Okay, all right.
So there is something about the prosumer camera that always is going to leave that subconscious, it's a cheaper camera, we don't have to care as much. Well, I mean, think about it yourself. If you get dropped into an environment where suddenly the camera isn't just one person kind of operating it right there.
Yeah.
Suddenly you got 3 people plus a couple of extra people in attendance to just one camera. Do you think you're going to take the production a bit more seriously?
Yeah.
Like
the camera must be
subconsciously.
important.
I mean, yeah. There are certain elements of that are just inescapable. So I think it kind of the part of the choice you make on a level like you were saying, Gareth Edwards, for example, at that level, part of the choice is, does the kind of everyone bringing their A game more important to me, or is my own immediacy more important to me as a filmmaker? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that kind of machinery that it takes to serve the cinema camera, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Forces that, that the rituals that you need to.
Yeah, so there is a question, like, do you feel as a filmmaker, do you feel that is an enabler that you have people specialized enough and that the seriousness of that specialization brings a certain mental attitude for the whole production? Do you feel that that is an enabler for you, or do you feel that that gets in your way?
It's an enabler for me because I also feel I'm a very, very big fan of being like a cog in a larger machine. It's like a subconscious thing of mine. Like if I'm just doing something completely on my own, then the fuck up is like a complete fuck up. Like it's whatever's happening has gone wrong. It's Ethan's fault. I mean, if you're a cog in a machine, it's still going to be Ethan's fault, but there's a very good chance that if the team knows what they're doing, things will be fine. It also means that you're being a bigger part of a machine, being surrounded by other people with their own expectations and their own things to do encourages you to work more efficiently. You're more selfless, I think, in that regard. Like you just do stuff. You just run around, The
answer that every single individual comes up with is going to be exactly that. It is going to be an individual answer.
Yeah.
Where I'm a little bit miffed with that whole notion is the ones who want to have their cake and eat it.
Yeah.
As in, if you want everyone to step up and be bringing their A game, if you want specialization, if you want to be in a situation where you don't necessarily have to think about the nuts and bolts, then you can't complain when that stops being spontaneous.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, I know what you mean. Like the idea that you have the whole machinery, the whole system set up, and then the fact that you shouldn't be annoyed that you can't just pick up the camera and you have to stay with what's been planned.
The flip side, if that immediacy is more important to you, if you feel like having structure and planning and craft behind what you're doing is holding you back, then I also think you at that level can't complain if it doesn't look like Blade Runner
So-and-so.
2049, or
Yeah.
if audiences can't make sense of time and space and aren't following your plot points. Like by making those choices, you have to sacrifice something.
Yeah. All right. So it sounds to me that we've got a lot of big differences that I hadn't really kept in mind. Like we've got the footprint of the whole thing, moving it, the weight, the actual, being more wary of like the space that it takes up on the set, the space the camera takes up on the set, that is, where you're approaching the image from, like where your viewfinder is. That I hadn't considered at all. Like when you mentioned the idea that with the prosumer camera, you're that way. That's point and shoot is how it's normally described.
You look closely at those kind of productions and go, like, how often do you get a low angle? Because you just cannot get low enough to actually see the screen when you're doing that. How often do you get a high angle? That's maybe a little bit more often because you can step on top of something to look down.
I think I was about to say that one of the things that I know that my only example here is Alien 3. I have still only watched Alien 3 of David Fincher's movies. I'm going to own that and let that pass through me. But what I've seen of David Fincher, and also Alien 3. Obviously, he uses low angles a lot, and his movies have that kind of classic, slow, steady, big camera feel to them, if that makes sense. Now that you bring that up, sorry, complete digression. And then let me keep track of what we've spoken about, because I've been too invested in the conversation to take notes, as per usual. I think we managed to digress pretty productively today. Would you say that we digressed, but we kind of kept it focused? I think we did.
Okay. I'll take your word for it.
All right. Okay. Yeah. I think that all of our digressions are relevant to what we're talking about for once. The link that we've sort of drawn between the modern aesthetics of a lot of movies, especially at like lower budget levels, and the style of shooting encouraged by prosumer cameras, like whether consciously or subconsciously, is probably one of the more interesting things that come out of this with. You'll be happy to hear that it's not an uncommon line of thought, but maybe that's been the case for as long as you've been working. So I'm not entirely sure. Sorry, just looking outside to see if I left my notes there.
At a certain level, it is a little bit more philosophical as well.
Yeah, sounds like it.
I am biased towards the more old school because that's where I came through. Over the last 5-6 years, it's become less and less of a consideration for beginners. And as such, because it's no longer entering the mindset so much to be deliberate and constructing time and space and constructing the story, I'm wondering, because that craft element of it has disappeared, is it even a choice anymore?
What do you mean?
Do you understand what I mean? Like if it's so alien, if it's so little consideration of being considered, is there even a choice of being more or less considered? Does that make sense?
Wait, can you say that again?
So if we're saying like we're equating the more old-fashioned level of craft as being more considered in our filmmaking choices, and we're saying that a lot of those considerations, the craft, the importance of craft is disappearing. It's no longer as much in the forefront of the questions that new filmmakers ask themselves. And the fact that even the question is disappearing.
Is there hope? Is that what you're asking?
No, it's more like, do filmmakers even get a choice when they first begin of being more or less considered?
Oh.
Do you understand what I mean?
I think so.
Like to put a similar situation for beginners when they're lighting, going big isn't a choice because they just don't have that concept of lighting. And by going big, I mean like big diffusion, big booklight, big pounds, whatever, right?
Yeah.
So if you don't even have that concept, if that concept isn't introduced to you, do you genuinely have a genuine choice of whether or not to go big? If you don't know that a 12 by 12
because you don't know
foot,
that it exists.
And that's what I mean with the craft side of filmmaking.
Got a Plato's cave situation happening right now.
If that isn't introduced, if that isn't made more conscious, if there isn't more awareness of that, do beginning filmmakers even get to have a choice of a more crafted, considered style? And this is me asking.
Well, I think that whenever people, like with every single person who loves movies, they're going to watch something that has a style that they like, and they're going to want to figure out what that is. And I think that things like that article that I just read saying old school, steady, like considered movement means that thought process isn't dead. But I mean, if you mean like the entire philosophy of shooting things might be changing so severely that like people don't think in the same way that they used to, maybe. Someone watches, hypothetically, Peter Hyams' The Relic and think, boy, I love the way that looked. I wonder how he achieved that.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that, because I'm not sure if Relic was one of them, but he did direct and DP
he shot
a lot of
the Relic as well. Yeah.
Yeah, he's Australian, isn't he?
He is, yeah.
Yeah.
I was in awe when I found out he shot that movie. God. And it's a good looking movie.
Whole heap of sci-fi action movies around that time that he both directed and shot.
Did he shoot Outland as well? I think he shot a number of his movies in the 90s. That was his big
absolutely
thinger. Yeah. Those movies are just so deliberately constructed and well thought out. And it's just a look that I like. If I can watch that movie and think to myself, I like the way this looks and I want to emulate it, then there is still a choice, just takes, you just got to find the words for it. And maybe it's harder to find the words for it now.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah. Like, it sounds to me like there's kind of like a spray and pray propaganda situation happening right now. Spray and pray agenda.
Do you want to have a go at it?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry.
We under the bus just then.
We've been kind of doing the wrap up anyway. So we've run through our ideas of like footprint and size and usability and, the modularness of the whole thing. Get to the final point, which was your idea of the cinema camera kind of being, because it requires so much management, being an object that like summons a well-organized, large team of people inherently.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't even thought about that at all. That's excellent. And I think you could technically work around that. A lot of prosumer cameras have casings these days. I've seen one on the Blackmagic that I've handled that make it more modular deliberately, but I mean, that's, not to account for cables and placement of openings and whether or not it has a SDI cable or not. You could simulate that, but the idea of a camera just being like a big box that needs a bunch of people to assemble it, instead of just being a camera, and that kind of creating this atmosphere of professionalism and expertise and rigidity, which seems to go hand in hand with the idea of it being a well-constructed, well-thought-out image.
There is balance to that. I think certainly there was an element of gatekeeping in that, and I do think that we have benefited from breaking some of that gatekeeping, but I do think like we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater to a certain extent.
Yeah. As you use that, you use that turn of phrase a lot.
Well, I think, like by throwing up the rigidity of the gatekeeping, we've thrown some of the craft and the consideration, the more considered approach out with it.
Well, do you think in that case, are we in, so there was...
So part of the barrier created more skillful practitioners. So by removing the barrier, I feel like we've also sacrificed some of the skill.
Yeah. Which maybe in that case, it kind of sounds like, in terms of throwing the baby out, that was kind of the antithesis to a thesis. And then at some point, there'll be a synthesis situation. Maybe Top Gun Maverick, maybe Joseph Kosinski starting that off. Who knows? Can I end this episode on a shrug? Who knows?
That feels like a very Gen Z. Oh, shit, I said that out loud too.
It's not a slur.
Yeah, sure. I'll shrug in sympathy.
Shrug?